But I think one of the terms that we just heard from Michael was that the church has to have a prophetic voice. And that is absolutely true. At the same time, the church has a call to a pastoral voice. And one of the points of wisdom among faith leaders is to decide when we speak with one voice and when we speak with the other. Not terribly different from my spouse and I when we have 4 children, learning to use our inside voice and our outside voice to show them whether we're kidding or serious. But part of what strikes me about the pastoral voice of both faith leaders and members of the faith community is I want to think about this acronym NIMBY for just a moment. You'll hear that a lot, NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y. It stands for Not in My Backyard. It's been around for a long time. I first encountered this acronym 25 years ago when I was doing work for environmental justice. And we saw a lot of wealthy neighborhoods and wealthy countries that were privileged enough to push their environmental problems off onto poorer neighborhoods and poorer countries. So it's been around for quite some time. And I have a love-hate relationship with that term. As we have heard, there's a lot of unfounded fear and anger that I think we can rightly call this NIMBY phenomenon. And in the face of that, we have to find that prophetic voice which tells the truth over and over and over and over again. So one small way that I tried to do that was that there was a city meeting at Costa Mesa. I couldn't get near the parking lot, much less in the building. So at home, I was in the chat room with folks. You know, they say never read the comments. The chat room is nothing but the comments. And you know, there was just a lot of really angry vitriol going on in the chat room as I was streaming the city council meeting. And ahead of time, I had taken a little document over here, and I put the link for Dr. Snow's cost study. And over here, also, I had a definition of permanent supportive housing. And over here, I had the URL to Jamboree Housing, particularly one of their pages where you can see what some permanent supportive housing looks like. And it doesn't look, you know, like this decrepit thing that people imagine. It's lovely. And so as the chat was going on, I was just throwing in this kind of heroically positive comment every now and then. And someone would say something that was dramatically wrong. And I would say, actually, you're not correct. And here's where you can find the truth. And I'd put the URL to Dr. Snow's study. Right? And you know, I know everybody was just telling me to shut up, more or less. But in some respect, just had to throw that out there. And it did seem that it emboldened a few other people to kind of start speaking up as well. And so it kind of takes that first voice that's willing to stand up and say, this is not right. This is not true. This is not the tone. This is not the definition of neighbor that we ought to be embracing. It's not easy, and I'd say we were a minority within that conversation. But what we didn't do, what I didn't go in to do, and this is what I feel like the NIMBY phenomenon does a little too often, and it worries me some. I don't want to get into a I'm not crying, you're crying sort of conversation with somebody where they try to make me out like an idiot and I try to make them out like they're evil. I don't think stupid and evil are the only 2 options here. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it's true, but one of the wisdom points I've run across in my life, it took a million opportunities for me to finally start to get it, is that when my first impulse is to push back, the wiser thing is to lean in. And I want to know, what is somebody really scared of? We have a preschool at this church, and it's surrounded by a fence, and you got to know the code to get in. We're not against security. We understand concerns that people have about safety and so forth. Now, I'm not going to define folks who are chronically homeless as particularly less safe than others. I'm not going to buy into that. But I do want to lean into people's concerns for safety. and their perceptions that cause them to dig in. And I think it is helpful to some extent. I'm not always sure that dialogue really happens, but to the extent that it could, I think if we lean into the real concerns that people have, reckon with them, acknowledge that we have those same kinds of concerns, particularly if some of us live in a gated community or something like that, where we're just wealthy enough not to have to deal with what some of these folks are really dealing with. And so instead of making it oppositional, I think it's helpful, if possible, to at least develop some sense of sympathy with the real concerns and real fears. Now, it's hard to do when people are just screaming crap. That's not true. But to the extent that we can. And it requires, I think, the long, hard work of developing neighbors and being a neighbor and neighboring others and being there and still being there. So that's just kind of my 2 cents in terms of the pastoral voice and the prophetic voice, both of which I think are incredibly necessary. I'm passing it on to others here.
I would just say that I agree, that my experience with these parents, they want to be heard. They want someone to hear them. And over time, they also listen. So it takes a lot of work. It takes persistence and constantly being out there, inviting these parents in. In my case, I keep going back to them and saying, let's get together. In a setting that is not confrontational. Let's hear your story. And, you know, that's one step at a time. That's like one person at a time, which is maybe where we are at this point. I don't know.
A couple things just really point out what's really important of what's already been said. I think that listening, that being present, I think what Mike said around the numbers is huge. I saw that around immigration in our city council meeting when the church showed up. And so there are going to be those, often it's like talking to a drunk person. You don't get into the conversation because you're not even talking about the same things. And so being present and listening and hoping that they will listen because they feel heard and they start to at least experience you as someone that they can trust. But I think also there's all that pre-work that we need to do. We're often reacting, right? So something comes up and we react, and we don't have any of the organization, we don't have the built-in relationships already with people in the city or other churches so that we can respond in a way that is smart, because we're already invested. We've listened to the experts. We already have the information, the stories, and hopefully we already have relationships with either people who are doing the work or with people who are vulnerable, whether that be our neighbors who are homeless or immigrants or those in poverty. So doing that pre-work, not just waiting till something comes up to the council, but being present. I know our city, when I first started doing the work of collaboration in our city with our churches, a couple of things that I noticed was that our city didn't see the churches as a resource. They saw them as a drain. So, something that caused traffic, something that took away resources from the city that they had to provide. They were only asked for things from the city. They were never given anything back. So for the church to start to be seen as a resource in the city is huge, because then the city and the politicians, I think, begin to listen to you. And also I can remember going to our homeless collaborative meeting, and I told them, I want to work with churches because we had a homeless liaison officer who, I'm a chaplain, so I went on a ride along with him, and he just started going by every church. And he's like, what's that church's story? And I don't know. And he began to share his own problem with that church, and specifically around homelessness. What's that church? And he did this for like 15 churches. And he's like, well, someone's got to know what their deal is. And I'm like, okay. And so that was kind of the impetus to like, hey, let's rally the church around homelessness and stop doing these singular acts like Brad talked about. Don't just grab some bread, peanut butter, and jelly, and let's go make some sandwiches. But to be present to our experts, to be around, to listen deeply, to make thoughtful ideas, because we know what our resources are if we're in a faith group, and we have these people, and we know what our abilities, that we can make thoughtful and intelligent contributions to end homelessness. Because, again, a lot of our churches aren't really interested in ending homelessness. They're interested in an event or a task that they can get involved in. And when we ask for those deeper relationships and those deeper sort of things, it's harder. But it's worth doing. And that's both the pastoral and the prophetic, because we need to wake people up from the numbness. Because that's when the people who are against it are reacting to it. Because all of a sudden they're viewing their whole world changing. And so then we get to walk in as a faith community, are people who just have compassion on others, not just our vulnerable, but all our neighbors, to be present, to listen, and to invite them to experience something which I've experienced from my friends who are experts in ending homelessness, and from having conversations with my neighbors who are homeless. And so that starts to radically change you. But I think we need to move to a place now where we're already having those discussions with all of our faith leaders, our pastors, our churches, so that we can respond in really a much more intelligent and compassionate way.
Let me just make a couple of brief remarks. I think there's two kinds of power. There's dominational power and there's relational power. And I think the faith community is called to engage in relational power. I'm going to go to confession here. Some decades ago, I was an organizer with the Santa Ana neighborhood organizations, and the Orange County Rescue Mission wanted to build a shelter in the heart of that neighborhood, the Santa Anita neighborhood, which is just west of, or just east of Harbor Boulevard. First Street runs through it, Fifth Street runs through it, and they wanted to buy the old Carpenters Union Hall and make it a shelter. They didn't have any, they never talked to us, they never sat down with us. They did try to shame us. They had one of their millionaire board members, who was a supporter of ours as well, came and saw me and tried to shame us and say that, how could you be so despicable? Now, he lived in a house on Irvine Cove, one of 5 houses on Irvine Cove, but I pointed out to him that, if you want to talk to us about the streets that aren't paved, if you want to talk to us about the schools that aren't serving the kids in our neighborhood, if you want to help us address the violence in the neighborhood, we could probably form a partnership. But we were never taken up on that offer. So trying to pull over a neighborhood is not the way to do it either. We need to engage wherever possible. That's one of the things that Dave Galanders, I think, has done, and Pastor Jason have made a very significant effort at trying to build rapport with the Little Chapman, Adelina neighborhood. There's still forces in there that are giving them a hard time. But we've got to find the good people. They're not our enemy. And we've got to form partnerships wherever we can.